And if you compare globally pheranocoumarin content of seeds, and this is the average, you notice that up there the New Zealand plants are all below average for the pheranocoumarins. They are just not pumping out the same pheranocoumarins that European plants with their long association are pumping out, and that plants in North America produce after associating with webworms for 150 years. I like how the New Zealand Herald reported the story, "Veg caught with its defenses down." And this actually underlies the success of many invasive species. This is called the enemy release hypothesis, that species that leave their enemies behind can become problems in their new homes. So the parsnip plant has to contend with parsnips in its home territory as well as generalist species, and competing with native specialists on their native hosts. But when it moves to a new area, it leaves behind the specialists, coping only with generalists that are not very well equipped to deal with it, and as a consequence can become way more competitive with native species and drive them out. Why is this an issue? Because invasive species, non-indigenous species, cost the US billions of dollars every year. Not just insects, not just plants, but all kinds. And leaving enemies behind appears to be an important advantage, particularly for chemically defended organisms. And many of the most noxious invasive species are chemically defended. It also is an object lesson for the practice of classical biological control, the idea of importing, releasing for establishment natural enemies to control an introduced exotic organism. This is an idea that was pioneered in the for plants in the mid-20th century. The idea is if you have a noxious weed, go to its homeland, find an insect that eats it, and bring it over and release it. And the noxious weed will reacquaint with its old host plant and drive it into oblivion. Dramatic demonstration of the Hypericum perforatum, Klamath weed, also called St. John's wort, was accidentally released in the western US in 1900. It is phototoxic to livestock. It contains this material called hypericin that causes the skin rash on lightly pigmented skin of horses. Infested 2 million acres of rangeland by 1944, enormously economically important. 2 species of leaf-feeding beetles that feed only on Hypericum were introduced from Europe, actually via Australia because of the war, released. By 1956, Klamath weed was a dim memory, and the savings from the introduction of these 2 herbivorous insects amounted to about $9 million of reclaimed rangeland. What's the lesson? Coevolution stops for no man. It's often seen that biocontrol is a permanent solution to a problem. All these authors define it as permanent control, permanent and expensive solution, permanent in nature, permanent ecological and economic management. Well, Klamath weed and Chrysolina have been renewing their acquaintance in the US for only 67 years, which is only half the time that parsnip webworms and wild parsnips have been reassociated. Given enough time, it's incredibly likely that Klamath weed will stage a similar comeback with more effective defenses and actually become more toxic as a result of associating with its biocontrol agent. One other lesson in the few minutes that remain. Dealing with your enemies can mess up your friendships. And we actually discovered this as a result of the work that we're doing in New Zealand. Now, plants make chemicals for all kinds of reasons and relate to insects in all kinds of ways. And among the most important ways is pollination. 75% of the world's 200,000 plus flowering plants require an animal partner to deliver pollen. It's this whole business of being rooted in the ground. You can't run away from your enemies, and you can't go out on a date. You have to stay to meet. You can't go to a singles bar to meet a mate. You have to rely on a preferably winged partner to deliver your pollen, your male sex cells, to an appropriate receptive female stigmatic surface. Parsnips are no different. They are insect pollinated, and one of the rewards or one of the insurance policies for enticing an animal partner is to produce chemical attractants. And parsnips actually do smell not unpleasant as flowers, and they produce a number of volatile compounds. Not as many as some flowers, but quite a few, and we were interested to find out which were important in mediating interactions with these pollinators. 73 different species of insects visit parsnip flowers. odd how the word gets thrown around, but C. Ritchie Bell, who worked on the pollination biology of umbellifers, calls parsnip a promiscuously pollinated plant. I don't think we should throw these judgmental names around. They are sort of a cornucopia plant in the sense that they have short nectar-secreting tissues that anybody with short mouth parts can reach. You don't have to have any elaborate behavior to get to the pollen. That's what they mean. I'm not sure, maybe casual or undemanding is a better adjective than promiscuous. But it means it's hard to figure out who's actually doing the pollinating. We know who's doing the visiting, but not the pollinating. And in fact, it's not the necessarily obvious individuals. So many of these species carry pollen, and some in disproportion to their size. Some of the biggest visitors carry a lot of pollen. Some not so big visitors also carry a lot of pollen. But by, again, work with Art, established that the visitors for which the number of visits is significantly correlated with seed set, the most effective visitors, the ones that actually transfer pollen to other parsnips, are blowflies and hoverflies. And frequent visitors actually are not very effective pollinators. They're there, they carry pollen, but not to the right place. So these are the key pollinators. Again, if there is another lesson, it's not always the most frequent visitor who's your best friend. So, octyl esters are important in attracting pollinators. When we went to New Zealand, we discovered octyl acetate is way higher in New Zealand plants than it is in North American plants. And we knew from earlier work that octyl acetate is actually an attractant for the caterpillar. Remember, the egg hatches on the leaf. The caterpillar has to find the flowers and fruits. That's a long trip. Octyl acetate is produced by flowers and fruits, not by leaves. It's used by the caterpillar to guide its way to the food. Parsnips in North America can't afford to advertise their flowers with octyl acetate. In New Zealand, where there have been no webworms historically, you can advertise for pollinators and not worry about getting hit by your enemies. So that was an interesting revelation we hadn't anticipated. So octyl acetate is higher in New Zealand, and likely the parsnips will be facing difficulties attracting pollinators as the webworm infestation proceeds. And that's not unique to North America, to New Zealand. Occasionally here in North America, when parsnips are not pollinated, when the flowers are not pollinated, the fruits are not aborted. Normally, when plants don't bother making fruits without seeds. A fruit is just a dispersal device, a suitcase for seeds, a way for the seeds to travel. Makes no sense for a plant normally to produce a fruit, to go build all the tissues required to make a fruit that has no seeds. We do it all the time. We make navel oranges, but we're humans. We have other ways of reproducing these plants, and besides, we do a lot of things that don't make a lot of sense. But so navel orange worms are so-called parthenocarpic fruits, fruits with no seeds. Why does parsnip hang on to its parthenocarpic fruits? Well, we found out these fruits that have actually no nutritive value, basically. There's no endosperm in there. There's no embryo. But there's also very few phrenocomerins. When given a choice, parsnip webworms overwhelmingly will choose parthenocarpic fruits. So if you have an umbel, a flower head, with these essentially decoy fruits, you can lure the webworms away from the viable fruits by feeding them this junk food, essentially. So there may be some advantage for the parsnips to hang on to these decoy fruits, whereas for most plants it would make no sense. Lesson 6: when life hands you navel oranges, make orangeade. Right. Okay, so these are some interesting stories from a species of little brown moth. What difference does it make? It's not an economically important insect. In fact, when I first started, the whole life cycle of this insect hadn't even been worked out. That's how unimportant parsnip is as an economic crop. And in fact, it doesn't even eat the economic part of parsnip. It doesn't eat the roots. It eats the seeds, the fruits. And there's only like 6 growers in the entire country that produce parsnips. And they're right around here in Washington State. And they're not that bothered by parsnip webworms. So they're not economically important. But what difference does a species make?